James Perloff, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you for having me on, Russell. First time on the show, and I see you've been around a long time.
James Perloff is the author of The Shadows of Power, an expose of the Council on Foreign Relations that has sold over 100,000 copies, and 2 books about the evidence against Darwin's theory of evolution, including Tornado in a Junkyard. He wrote for the New American Magazine for nearly 3 decades. His newest book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, is a comprehensive look at the satanic drive for world government. James also wrote the script for the documentary Shadow Ring. Everyone needs to check that out. To learn more about James Perloff, visit jamesperloff.com. Before we get into your new book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, I'd like to talk about your first book, The Shadows of Power, which was published way back in 1988, well before the Internet. Pre-Internet, where did you get your sources from? I mean, how did you know so much? Where did you get the information?
Well, I was first introduced to the idea that American politics were different than what was presented to the broad public, that there was, in fact, an oligarchy behind the scenes. And that came to me through reading a book in 1978 by Gary Allen called None Dare Call It Conspiracy. And that led me to the headquarters of the John Birch Society, which happened to be close to where I was living. I found that they were very much involved with that book. They certainly sold it. It was their bestseller at the time. And having some writing skill, I began to write for their magazine, The New American. And I worked for a year in their research department. And as you said, this is pre-internet, but they had the equivalent of a Google there in their research department. What I mean by that is they had all kinds of rare books on their bookshelves, we call alternative media. And also they had files. So if you wanted to look up, for example, the Kennedy assassination, they would have like 3 very deep files with folders with newspaper clippings and magazine clippings and rare items that you wouldn't find normally if you went to a library. And that helped me write articles for their magazine, but also contributed to my book, The Shadows of Power. And The Shadows of Power actually began as an article cover story for the New American Magazine, but it became so long it would have overflowed the magazine's page limits. And finally, the publisher said, well, why don't we just make this into a new book? And so that's what we did.
So what is one world government and why should we fear it? Because globalization seems inevitable.
I suppose the march of progress, and one could say that communications are, making it inevitable. But the problem is, one way of looking at it is that it's the concentration of power into one place, and we're actually moving towards world government, I should mention, for people who don't know it, on a stepping stone basis. The UN was actually an attempt to impose world government from the top down, and the Korean War was in fact a war intended to validate the UN as a world peacekeeper. It did not succeed in convincing nations to surrender peacekeeping status or sovereignty to the UN, so they decided as of 1974 to use a bottom-up approach to world government, so it'd be constructed through various elements like environmental agreements and trade agreements and so forth, but most importantly through regional bodies. Even actually, George Orwell's 1984, the nations are divided into regional bodies like Oceania and East Asia. And so what we have in the EU is something that is sovereignty destroying, and it came out of the common market, which was sold to Europeans as simply being an economic prosperity building tool, which it was not. But from that, they developed the European Parliament and ultimately the European Union with its euro. And NAFTA, in the same manner as the common market was intended to transfer into the evolve into the EU, NAFTA is supposed to evolve into a North American Union, and that would have happened had it not been for vigilant Americans, including a few congressmen who stood up against that. But they already had plans for us to have an Amero and a North American ID card. In fact, I have an article that I can grab. I think I can grab it.
You know, you say Americans, congressmen and such, rose against it. Do you think Canadians don't have a say in this?
Oh, I'm sorry. I know you're in Canada. I didn't mean to disregard Canadians. I'm sure that just like in England they've got the UKIP, their Independence Party wants to stay out of the EU. I'm sure the Canadians and Mexicans who don't want part of a North American Union either. But I was going to mention a quote from Zbigniew Brzezinski, which really embodies the entire strategy. Here's what he said in 1995. He said, quote, "We cannot leap into world government in one quick step. The precondition for globalization is progressive regionalization." They understand this is what they call, Russell, this is what they call boiling the frog. You can't get world government overnight, so you have these regional bodies which eventually cross over. And of course, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, is intended to do that with Europe, as just as the TTP is designed to help consolidate us with Asia. They're moving towards a world government. As to your original question, why should we fear it? Well, when the founding fathers, and I have complaints about the founding fathers, but one of the things they did wisely was to divide power and not put it all in one place. You didn't have a president with autocratic dictatorial powers. You had his power balanced by the House and the Senate, who could offset each other. And of course, you had a judicial branch that if the others were doing something unconstitutional, they could say that was unconstitutional. And in their original vision, they also wanted the states to act as a check on the federal power, which is why they had the 10th Amendment, which said that any power not vested in the federal government by the Constitution belonged to the states, and that's been overridden and basically trampled upon ever since the Civil War. Pretty much decided that one. But the problem is that when you put all power in one place, there's no checks and balances, and you have the threat of dictatorship. There's no world government. You would have one of the advantages of having different countries which are sovereign is that if a nation becomes a dictatorship and very evil and is oppressing its own people, you can hopefully escape. You can jump over the Berlin Wall and get to freedom, for example. You can get to another country where there is greater freedom. But if you have a world government with just your IMF types running it, all of a sudden you find that there's no place to run. There's no place on the planet. Now, that's not the case we have right now, but if you watch these developments taking place and you see what's happening with the EU and NAFTA, you know we're on that road. That's their ultimate goal, and that is the danger. It's the potential to create an autocratic government. If you don't think it would be evil, just look at what the world leaders are doing, with their wars and their population control, their chemtrails and so forth. You know that they're up to no good. They're not going to establish this world government to establish any kind of world prosperity and happiness for the people.
Well, perhaps the end justifies the means. At the end of it, we have benevolent government.
Based on their record, I'd have to say that's not true at all. There's Jesus Christ said, "You shall know them by their fruits." Their fruits have been evil. Their fruits have been oppression. Their fruits have been stealing people blind, giving corporate bailouts while, a disabled veteran has to be turned down for a few $100s of benefits. So these people do not have our best interests at heart. I would rule that out just based on their record.
It's an election year, and I've been asking my guests the past few shows about their opinion on the candidates. We have Trump, Rubio, and Cruz left on the Republican side, and we have Clinton and Sanders left on the left. Of the candidates, who's the most pro-one-world government, and who is the least?
To answer that question, Clinton is the most pro-world government, and Trump is the least. And I think that they've already picked Hillary Clinton, unless something really comes up that derails her. She is pro a one world government. She's pro GMO. She's pro Monsanto. She's pro immigration. She's pro gun control. She's pro banker. She gets more donations from Goldman Sachs than any other candidate in her party. I think only Jeb Bush competes with her on the Republican side. So she's the one the bankers would want in. And I think that most probably we're looking at a deliberate splintering of the Republican side to make sure that she does get in. They would not go with Sanders. I think they're okay with the socialist being president, but the problem is that Sanders is adamantly and I think sincerely anti-big banker. He would not go for big banker bailout, so he's out. As far as Trump goes, who's the leader in the polls, as I understand it, Trump is very much against immigration, immigration is part and parcel of their New World Order plan. And also he's come out very strongly in favor of the Second Amendment. He even says he's got his own concealed carry permit. So I don't think he could go back on that, although politicians do break their promises, as we know. But I think that Hillary fills the bill. And they've also shown their confidence in Hillary because she's already had 2 terms in the White House, if we can call it that, as Bill Clinton's wife. And, of course, we'd be re-electing Bill Clinton. Since they approved the Clintons already, and since she fits their agenda 100%, I think she's the person of the hour for them, and I think that's who they want in.
Who do you think my audience should vote for? Trump?
Well, if I had to pick amongst these, I would vote for Trump. But I do want to say that they have been they never let a genuine individual who is opposed to their agenda get in power. And let me give you. I have a friend named Rachel McIntosh. She's written a book called Security Through Absurdity. It's about her experiences in the defense industry and in politics. She was in the defense industry. She saw the corruption there. And she wound up working for Ron Paul in his candidacy. And she was a delegate to the 2012 Republican convention. Now, what happened at that convention is there was supposed to be a speech by Ron Paul the Monday of that convention week. And they announced it was a hurricane so that he couldn't have the speech. Well, there was no hurricane. It was just a normal rainstorm. But the Ron Paul people went to the convention center anyway, and they showed a movie that was promoting Mitt Romney, showing Mitt Romney shaking hands with common folks, and it was all about the glories of Mitt Romney. And then all this applause in the stadium, it was deafening, and she looked around and there was nobody applauding. It was all being piped in, and you know, sports teams do this to boost the morale of the team when the fans aren't applauding. So when she went back to her hotel, her husband called up and said, "Wow, there was some ovation Mitt Romney got." She said, "No, dear, no one was applauding. That was fake." Now, Ron Paul could have gotten a nomination, at least a fight on the floor, but at the last minute, the Republicans changed the rules by which delegates were selected, and so as a result, the Ron Paul delegates were thrown out. Now, the people from the Ron Paul campaign, they wanted to vote on this rules change, but when the buses came to the hotel, the buses were late, so they didn't even get to the convention hall in time. So let me just see if I can grab a quote here. Okay, this is a quote from my 1988 book, The Shadows of Power, and it's about the 1952 Republican Convention. Quote, "At the Republican nominating convention, dirty tricks abounded. The rules for selecting delegates were changed. Taft delegations from Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas were thrown out and replaced by Eisenhower supporters." Unquote. That's a quote from me 26 years ago, writing about a convention that took place 60 years before this Tampa convention that my friend Rachel McIntosh. And let me give you one more quote, and this is from 1940. This is from the 1940 Republican convention when Wendell Willkie became the nominee, even though 7 weeks before the nominating convention, only 3% of all Republicans wanted him. There was a media blitz, and this is a quote from Congressman Usher Burdick, quote, "We Republicans in the West want to know if Wall Street and the bankers control our party and can select our candidate. I believe I'm serving the best interest of the Republican Party by protesting and exposing the machinations and attempts of J.P. Morgan in forcing Wendell Willkie on the Republican Party. There's nothing to the Willkie boom for president except the artificial public opinion being created by newspapers, magazines, and radio. The reason in back of this is money. Money is being spent by someone and lots of it," unquote, Usher Burdick. Now, just to take it one step back further, if you read America's 60 Families by Ferdinand Lundberg, he describes how Herbert Hoover was selected by this at the convention and back in the 20s by the same type of some maneuverings. But it's the same for the Democrats. He describes in that book how Woodrow Wilson, backdoor deals were made to get him in. And you move it up to 1976, 9 months before the Democratic convention, only 4% of all Democrats wanted Jimmy Carter as president, according to the Gallup poll. But all of a sudden, after his dinner with David Rockefeller at Rockefeller's estate was a big Brzezinski, who he later made his national security advisor. There was a big boom for Jimmy Carter. His picture was on Time, the cover of Time 3 times, Newsweek's cover twice. He was on all the networks. The Wall Street Journal had a editorial saying he was the best candidate in the Democratic Party, and the New York Times ran a series of puff pieces on him, so he gets the nomination. Same with Clinton. After he went to the Bilderberg Convention in 91, he became the candidate in 92. Barack Obama, they say, disappeared in 2008, right when the Bilderbergers were holding their conference. And if you look at Clinton, she's got it in the bag. I mean, Bernie Sanders won a landslide in New Hampshire, but she gets the most of the delegates because they got these super delegates. It's already set up for Hillary. So what I'm saying is the Republicans and Democratic candidates for president are chosen in advance, and I believe that the elections are a sham. But if I had to vote, I'd vote for Trump simply because he's saying the most right things.
It seems that the establishment on the Republican side is going for Rubio.
I wouldn't be surprised. I haven't looked very strongly at these candidates because of my pessimism about the meaning of elections, but they're certainly trying to split the Republicans. National Review, which is a major establishment Republican voice, came out with a Let's Stop Trump campaign, and looks like they're ready to splinter the vote, kind of similar to the way they splintered the vote in 1912 between ex-Republican Teddy Roosevelt on his Bull Moose ticket and the incumbent Republican Taft. In order to get Wilson elected with a minority of the vote, he only had like 42% of the popular vote, but he got to be president. And if you do that to get Hillary in right now, but yeah, Rubio seems the most establishment type of guy amongst the three running.
Yeah, I would say that the trump card, no pun intended, is Bloomberg. If he goes in, that fractionalizes it even further. That's their failsafe.
I'm sorry, Bloomberg would become the candidate, or how does he fit in?
Yes, there's the potential for Bloomberg, Mayor Bloomberg, to be running for the GOP as a late contender. But I am curious, if you think this splitting, this division in the Republican Party is deliberate, is Trump in on it?
Yeah, there's an interesting video. I don't know if you've ever seen any of the videos by Brother Nathaniel. He was a man who was born and raised Jewish, but is now very anti-Zionist. And he has a interesting video called Trump's Deck of Jewish Cards, and he points out that not only is he surrounded by Zionists, but he has a big number of Zionist IOUs. He went bankrupt with Trump Entertainment. He was bailed out by a Jewish, I guess a conglomerate of bankers, but I think the main one was a Jewish banker billionaire named Carl Icahn. And Trump, his daughter converted to Judaism and married into a Jewish billionaire family. And Trump is the only American celebrity that I'm aware of that actually made a campaign ad for Benjamin Netanyahu that was aired in Israel. So I think that he is backed by the powerful Zionist forces, although he's talking American. I think he'd be another person who would put the interests of America behind those of Israel, as both Obama and Bush have done with our Middle Eastern wars.
And in just the last debate, trumpeted his love for Israel.
That does not surprise me at all. In fact, that seems to be almost a qualifying credential.
Yeah, it was going to say, each one of them sort of took their time trying to kiss the asshole of Israel as firmly and as puckerish as possible. It was humorous, to say the least. No, I like Israel more than you. No, I support Israel even more. Yeah,
I'm glad to hear you say that. I'm half Jewish myself, and it took me a while on my learning curve. I started out sort of thinking that the world's greatest evil was communism, and I started writing during what was still the Cold War era, and it took me a while to figure out the linkage between Zionism and communism, and that the Zionists play a tremendous hand, and in fact, I would say the foremost hand in the development of world politics. And certainly, they have a plan for a greater Israel that's been laid out. It was laid out at their Zionist Congress beginning in 1897. And right now, the blog post I'm working on, although I keep getting interrupted to write more current things, is on what's called the Schofield Reference Bible, which became the reference Bible used by evangelical churches. And you could say it was dictated by the Zionists. It is just filled with false interpretations of the Bible, predicting that the Jews must return to Zion. The big edition of that Bible was published in 1917, which not coincidentally was the same year that the Balfour Declaration was issued, in which Britain promised Lord Walter Rothschild that they would establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and began the troubles that we see now unfolding in the Middle East.
And just to correct what I said earlier, Bloomberg wouldn't enter as a GOP candidate, but as an independent.
Oh, as an independent. Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, I didn't hear about his name in connection with the GOP.
Well, he's been a member of both the Democratic and the Republican Party.
Thank you for, I haven't looked much into Bloomberg history recently, but Wendell Willkie is an example of somebody how they can actually thrust a candidate at the last minute, and actually through media blitz. And as you undoubtedly know and have had your guests say, more than 90% of mainstream media is controlled by just 6 corporations, which, by the way, do not disagree with each other on any significant issue, except that you'll see a little bit of shadowboxing between Fox and CNN on some peripheral issues. But with the media behind them, they could really make you or me a president and vice president if they wanted to pop us enough.
A question here from the audience. Actually, we have several questions. What are his thoughts concerning this current pope?
Well, I think that traditionally the Pope was an enemy of this, if I might say so, this oligarchy I'm talking about that Ferdinand Lundberg described in 1937 in his book America's 60 Family. It goes way back, and it goes back centuries. You could go back to John Robinson's book in 1798 called Proofs of a Conspiracy, about the attempt to overthrow the established order in Europe by destroying the church, the family, the governments, and actually we've seen all the governments that existed and overthrown, starting with the King of France. Remind me the question, because I just drew myself onto a little rabbit hole there. Give me the question again, I'm sorry.
What are his thoughts concerning this current pope?
The Pope seems to be, I'm not a Catholic, by the way. I am a Christian, but not a Catholic. I have the greatest respect for the historic tradition of the Catholic Church and I think that they were regarded by as a great enemy by this oligarchy if we go back 100 years. But today we see the Pope being very politically correct, and he had a 192-page encyclical on global warming, and we see him attending these international conferences, addressing the UN, and he seems to be walking in step with the New World Order agenda. We've got the Vatican Bank, which I understand the Rothschilds are the foremost controllers of, and so it seems that unfortunately the Pope is compromised and has become part of the problem rather than an opponent of it.
Same audience member asks, is talk of an EMP being exploded over America a real fear or hype? I think Ben Carson mentioned that in one of the debates.
I don't know. I do feel, though, that they would not mind at all once they get everybody completely dependent on things that are in the cloud and online, all your banking's online. They could create real chaos by taking down the cloud and taking out our ability to go online, and medical records are now being put all online, and I work as a medical professional, and we're forced to actually chart online now, and it seems to me that one of the things they want to do is they want to be able to take people's money away and having all money be digital is one way they can do that, and all information. We're so dependent now on Google. If all of a sudden we didn't have paper resources, hard copy things we could look at, all of a sudden our information is gone. I have a feeling that when they talk about ISIS created an EMP, I think what they're probably talking about is the stage at which they will take down the internet and blame it on North Korea or somebody like that. But I don't know how real it is. I've not looked intensively at AMP, but I've tried to see how real it is, and there seems to be some disagreement about how much electrical devices would be affected. Some people say that anything electronic would be wiped out by it, but other people say that that's not true. I don't know what your sources have been telling you, or if you've had anybody on, Russell, who's elaborated on that, who's done more of a study of it.
No, not specifically on this program. The Bible prophesies of a one-world government and a one-world currency.
It does, and this is where the Bible becomes relevant to our discussion, and I wish more Christian pastors were talking about it. The Bible prophesies that there will be a figure called the Beast or Antichrist who will take over the world, and it says specifically that he will govern over every nation, tribe, and people. Now, to govern the world, you need a world government. And so I like to point out to people that, when he arrives, he's not going to just snap his fingers and say, hocus pocus is my world government. We're seeing the UN going back to the League of Nations. We see the Kyoto Protocol and the World Trade Organization and the World Court, and all these things are NAFTA, as we mentioned before, and the EU are taking us on that road where you would have an Antichrist type of figure. And as a matter of fact, just as further affirmation of this, I'd like to mention that some of the best analysts of the New World Order oligarchies, such as Ted Gunderson, late special agent in charge of the Los Angeles office of the FBI when he had 700 FBI personnel on him, he came out of the box and exposed this stuff, and he said these guys are Satanists. He specifically confirmed the works of William Guy Carter, who wrote the great book Pawns in the Game back in the 50s, who said these guys were Satanists, and John Coleman, ex-MI6 officer, said they're Satanists. And if you just look at the Bohemian Grove and the way these guys behave, it's clear that they are having a Luciferian agenda. Then you take a look at what Hollywood's doing, and you look at the Super Bowl halftime shows with Madonna dressing up as Baphomet and the statue of Baphomet recently unveiled in Detroit, Michigan, and you've got this new show on Fox called Lucifer, where Lucifer's the good guy. You can see that there's definitely a Luciferian agenda, which would be cohesive with the biblical prediction. And as to the question of currency, we've seen ourselves go from a hard currency, gold and silver, to paper money, to digital money. And of course, the end game that they're looking for, going back over a decade, they've been talking about planting chips in people. Initially as a lure to us, they say, well, it'll be great, if your dog gets lost, you'll have a chip in him so you can find him. And if your parent with Alzheimer's gets lost, we'll have a chip in them so we can find out where they are. Or if you're unconscious, we can have a chip in you and they can read your medical record in the ER. But the problem is that chip also acts as a GPS where the government can track your whereabouts. They could actually send you presumably destructive signals by that chip. But the chip, in terms of currency, would be, the idea is that everybody would have a chip that they would use, and some people already have this, where you can wave instead of waving a credit card, you wave your hand, and the Bible says that everybody will have the mark of the beast either in their hand or their forehead, and they won't be able to buy or sell without it. So you can easily see how that prophecy would come true. So I definitely believe we're looking at a spiritual dimension, and yes, we're seeing world events that are cohesive with the Bible forecasts about the future, and in this case, the near future.
Another question from the audience. This is Han on Godlike Productions, and he's asking, is he stating that the lust for power is in and of itself satanic from the point of view of doing absolutely anything to obtain it, or does he believe that Satan is directly involved, and this is spiritual warfare? If the latter, what are his specific recommendations for combating or abating it?
Yeah, I definitely think it is. There's this pyramid on the back of the dollar bill that 33rd or 32nd degree Freemason Franklin D. Roosevelt had put there, although it dates back to the American Revolution. It just didn't appear in the dollar bill until his reign as president. If you look at that pyramid, it's not complete. There's this pyramid that's almost finished. It's not there yet. That's your Novus Ordo Seclorum, your New World Order. And at the top is the all-seeing eye of Satan, who, because of our internet surveillance, could appear to be all-seeing because he could know everybody about everyone through internet collection of data, and he could appear to be all-knowing like God is. But I believe this is definitely a spiritual battle. I think that the Rothschilds and the Zionist bankers are the highest visible rung of the pyramid, and below them you would have their Freemasonic types, your Gentile, your J.P. Morgan types who are carrying out their orders towards this New World Order. But definitely it is spiritual in the end, and it looks as if Satan, who knows his time is short, according to the Bible, does want to reign as it says in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 in the Bible that the abomination of desolation will set himself up in God's temple, pretending to be God. In fact, I should probably get the exact quotes so I'm not Okay, here we go. 2 2 Thessalonians 2, 3, and 4, it says, quote, "Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day," meaning the end of days, "will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction, who will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God," unquote, for the Bible. And, there's this plan in Israel, of course, to rebuild the temple. We're not supposed to do that. Jesus pronounced a curse on the temple. This whole idea is satanic. But there's definitely this plan of Satan to set himself or some sort of proxy up in Jerusalem over Greater Israel, which would be the capital of this world government, and to oppress mankind for what the Bible predicts will be a period of 3.5 years. So it is both human in that you have these banksters who are promised, mansions and power in return for their favors, but at the top, the very, very top, you do have a Luciferian agenda, as I said, Bohemian Grove and the Satan worship that various intelligence analysts have talked about these people doing shows that it is Luciferian. And again, that affirms what we were talking about earlier, how this is not a beneficial but an evil agenda that is the end game of this world government.
We have another question from the audience. This is Happy Tard on GLP. Is it still an armed U.S. citizenry keeping the one world government at bay?
Yeah, I think so. We have the highest gun ownership. I understand we have 80 million gun owners here in America, and they can't really institute a police state as long as we've got that. So I certainly see these false flag shooting events, San Bernardino and Chattanooga and Garland, Texas, and all these other events I've seen happen. Some of them may be rural or Aurora, and we've seen Sandy Hook. We've seen so many of these things which are always followed by calls for gun control, and you've seen President Obama trying to override the Second Amendment by doing what's unconstitutional, by having executive orders to have guns collected from certain people on watch lists. And some people might think, well, I'm not on a watch list, so it's not a big deal. But wait till they put the constitutionalists on the watch list. It's not just going to be ISIS. So for sure, they are definitely.
Well, I think in principle, it's fair to keep the guns out of the hands of the wackos. I'm not suggesting that constitutionalists are wackos. I'm suggesting that wackos, nutcases, shouldn't have these things.
I'm in agreement with that. Absolutely. Just as you would, a child abuser, you'd have to put him behind bars. You have to take measures against people who are absolutely a threat to society. No question.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That's a well-known quote from Carl Sagan. In your newest book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, what's the most extraordinary evidence you have in this book?
Well, I think it's really collective, and if you just took one piece of it, no piece of it would supply the evidence. But you look at the League of Nations, and you look at the fact that because of the U.S. Senate's rejection of the League of Nations in 1919, they wouldn't ratify the Versailles Treaty that created the League. Then you see the Council on Foreign Relations created as a direct result of that. They were incorporated in 1921, and this Council on Foreign Relations, which is a subject of my earlier book, The Shadows of Power, has dominated the presidential cabinets, whether the guy in the Oval Office is a Republican or a Democrat. And then you look at the UN being created by these same guys, and these same guys create the World Bank and the IMF. And I know that officially those were instituted at the Bretton Woods Conference, but the Council on Foreign Relations was fomenting those even before then. Then you look at these regional bodies like the EU and NAFTA, and you just see all these globalist measures taking place collectively, and even a drive for one world religion. So it's really, I don't think there's any one piece of evidence in there, but I should probably mention what's in this book, by the way. I have one thing. People hear me say this all the time, and you've heard me say it because you heard that interview on my website. But it's like a jigsaw puzzle, and if you just talk about 9/11 to people, they say, "Well, our own government wouldn't do that to us," and if they did, they tell us about it on TV. So you have to give people the whole picture, and that's what I try to do as concisely as possible in this book. So the first chapter is about. It's not just 9/11, it's the sinking of the Maine, it's the Lusitania, it's the foreknowledge of Pearl Harbor, it's the artificially created Korean War, it's Tonkin Gulf, it's a no WMD no WMDs in Iraq. This has been going on for a long time. And then I say, well, why do you have this pattern? And so we talk about the fact that the same guys are running the government. I talk about the Council on Foreign Relations in Chapter 2. Chapters about the Fed and how it's wrecked our economy. And I just to run them down, then I talk about the ways that run America, and then I talk about the Vietnam War because it was such an important event. And then I talk about the plan today with the NAFTA, as we've already touched on. Then I talk about media control, and I've got a chapter on the ways they've destroyed national sovereignty. I talk about their international control structures like the Bilderbergers and Trilateral Commission. There's a chapter on environmentalism, which is a tool for control, excuse for control. There's a chapter on Zionism and a whole chapter on 9/11, and don't you need at least a chapter on that? And then chapters on the control of the arts, and a chapter on the war on faith, and a chapter on the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and a control on cyber tyranny, and on vaccines, and on weather control. So I try to give people the whole picture so that they're not getting just one piece of the jigsaw puzzle, because one piece of a jigsaw puzzle, it looks like just a piece of color with no meaning. But if you take a piece of a jigsaw puzzle and you snap it into the entire puzzle, now you see what the big picture is, and now that piece makes sense to you. And that's what I'm trying to do with this book, and what we're trying to do on this show, really.
Would you consider yourself a conspiracy theorist?
You know, I was on Tex Mars' show, pre-recorded, it hasn't been up on the air yet, and he said, I'm a conspiracy scientist. I like that a lot. And I said, what we're doing is, what I told him and what I say in the book, too, is I say we're really like district attorneys. It's very rare for a criminal to commit a murder right on videotape, right, or right in front of witnesses. So a district attorney has to assemble pieces of evidence, like who had motive? Did this guy have motive? Did he have connection to the weapon? Were his fingerprints on it? Did he have gunpowder residue on his clothing? Was he seen leaving the scene of the crime? If you can build up enough indirect evidence, accumulate it, you can get a preponderance of evidence to present to a jury and get a verdict of guilty. And so what we do is we say, hey, look, the Federal Reserve was planned at Jekyll Island. That was admitted by Frank Vanderlip, the president of Citibank, who was there. And present at that meeting were Paul Warburg of the Rothschild interest and Benjamin Strong. And so now look what happens when the Fed gets created. Benjamin Strong's head of the New York Fed, and Paul Warburg is vice chairman of the Federal Reserve. Is that a coincidence? No. Obviously, we're not paranoid to connect the dots and say, that happened by chance. The guys who created the Fed got to run it. It's by design. So we're just doing the same thing that a district attorney would do. We take the pieces of evidence and we logically tie them together, and we present them to the jury, who's our readers or listeners or viewers of alternative media. And we say, here's the evidence. You make up your mind. Is our story more credible, or is the defense attorney, meaning CNN and Fox, is their story more credible? And all these things are just a bunch of coincidences.
Tell me about the Beatles. Were the Beatles a setup?
Well, John Coleman, I mentioned him before, former MI6. He talks about that, and when I saw the Beatles, I was seventh grade, and what everybody was talking about the next day, they were on Ed Sullivan, is what I'm talking about. They were on Ed Sullivan, and it's kind of one of those critical moments for America when the culture changed. And what people were talking about was not the music. They were talking about these incredible screaming girls in the audience. And looking at some of the evidence that's accumulated since then, it appears that these girls were, just like we have crisis actors today, they were paid basically. And it's my understanding that when the Beatles arrived at Kennedy International Airport, there are all these screaming girls. I remember it was like the Pope had arrived, and now it turns out that they were all from the same school in Brooklyn. They didn't really know who the Beatles were, but they were paid $20 each to go out and scream. And so what happened, the Beatles changed the culture. I mean, they were the center of the whole cultural revolution of the 60s. Everything was Beatles-centered, and men started growing their hair long because the Beatles grew their hair long. And why did they start emulating the Beatles? Well, they thought that that's what pretty young chicks want, So that's a lot of what we see is culturally artificial. According to John Coleman, when the Beatles went on Ed Sullivan, he said they couldn't play more than 4 basic chords, and most of that music had actually been created by the Tavistock Institute, which is a British central agency for brainwashing and cultural manipulation. And whether he's right or not, I've seen this happen so many times where they say that even with the elections today, I just tweeted this last night, an article showing that a lot of the people who show up at these town halls and election rallies are actually paid actors to make the candidates look good. And this sort of thing has been going on for a long time. So, yeah, I think that the Beatles were engineered. And if you really want to look deeply at the music industry of the 60s, look at the late Dave McGowan's book called Weird Scenes in the Valley. And he talks about all the connections between the hippie musicians that were of that era. Just to take one example, the Doors. Jim Morrison, the Doors, was a son of Admiral Morrison, who was in command of the forces at Tonkin Gulf. And Dave McGowan draws all these connections between those rock groups and the military-industrial establishment. It's amazing because those rock groups were supposedly rebelling against it, but I can believe it because when I was a hippie, back around the early 70s, I used to sell a thing in the streets of Boston called The Real Paper, the most left-wing paper in Boston. But you know who the publisher of The Real Paper was? It was David Rockefeller Jr. I mean, the establishment, the cultural manipulations we see are often generated and artificially created. So, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Beatles were very much, set up and designed to change our culture from Leave It to Beaver to Woodstock.
We have another question from Happy Tard from Godlike Productions. Will there be any clues that the global enslavement is imminent, such as a lockdown of the Internet?
Well, that would be a clue, and one clue we see right now is tightening up with censorship. We've seen Jim Fetcher's book on Sandy Hook banned by Amazon, which I think is kind of a first for Amazon, and also recently Dr. James Tracy was fired by his Florida University. He's been a vocal critic of false flag shooting events in Sandy Hook. And actually, I consider this a testament that we're doing our job because they're getting scared and they're having to crack down. Of course, the Zionists have been doing that for a long time. We recently saw Ursula Haverback, a German lady who's 87 years old, sent to prison simply because she challenged the function of Auschwitz. She said it was not a death camp, it was a work camp, and she knew from her own past that was true. So we're seeing people going to prison for politically incorrect views and being censored, and they haven't locked down the whole Internet. I think they still need it to survey us and use it as a surveillance tool and a control tool. But they are scared because it turns out that the truth movement has been much more vigilant and much more adept at figuring out what they're doing than I think they anticipated. So I would certainly take that as a clue. And actually, all we're looking at the death of a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court seems to indicate that if that death was not accidental, they're starting to get extreme in their measures. And certainly the ramping up of false flag shootings under Obama, which were more than the 4 presidents before him combined, are indicating that they are getting afraid. Zbigniew Brzezinski has a pretty famous quote. Let me see if I get the exact quote. It is. Oh, here we go. Quote, in earlier times, it was easier to control 1 million people literally than physically to kill 1 million people. Today, it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people, unquote. So he's indicating that, he indicates in that speech, which you can hear online on YouTube, which he gave at the Royal Institute of International Affairs in England, that the masses are waking up, and they're afraid of that. They're afraid of the masses waking up and overthrowing this global tyranny that they envision. And so one way they have to do that is to clamp down on Freedom of Information Act and demonize us, make us look like we're loons and so forth. And so, but we are being successful, and the fact that they're reacting this way is an indicator of it.
Talk about population control. It seems like this new Zika virus is right up their alley.
Whether it's Ebola or Zika virus, they're always trying to come up with a new excuse to vaccinate us. I do have a chapter on vaccines in my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, and it was one of those things that dawned on me. I thought, well, these guys don't really do much in the medical profession, do they? Because I'm in the medical profession, and all of a sudden I realized, yeah, they do. And it's very evident that we saw it with the H1B1 the flu that came up a few years ago, and they wanted to have mandatory vaccination for that, and it turned out to be no threat. Just as in 1976, when the swine flu scare happened, and President Gerald Ford went on television and said everybody has to get the swine flu vaccine, and 136 million was appropriated for Congress for that vaccine, and people were dropping dead from it. They were getting paralyzed, and the swine flu turned out to be no threat at all. It's not so much they are capable and do manufacture viruses, but I think they prefer the vaccine method of population control, because vaccines can be very directed against which individuals get them, whereas a virus can go out of control, and who knows, but the establishment, the oligarchy, might end up contracting the virus themselves.
By the way, just an interesting note, the Supreme Court in Canada has ruled that Canadians have a right to doctor-assisted suicides, so that is something that is being permitted now throughout hospitals in Canada.
And that goes along with, the whole population control agenda goes back in time to Roe v. Wade and the legalization of abortion. Now, I know that was dressed up as women's rights, but it's really a method of population control. You go back to the early part of the 20th century, you had the whole eugenics movement about people who are unfit should be sterilized. So this is all part of that. This is all weather control, too, I believe, is part of that, If you dropped a bomb on a town and wiped it out, people would say, who dropped the bomb? But if you have a HAARP-directed tornado wipe out a town, people say it was an act of God. And so they're aware of that. And they seem to have an arsenal of high-tech weaponry right now that they're using in order to bring down the world population, because they know that a smaller population will be easier to control once world government is in place.
Well, meanwhile, the population of the Earth keeps going up.
Yes.
Last question from Happy Tard on Godlike Productions is, what can we do to stop this one world government, and will spiritual work help?
Some people think that talk is cheap and that we should rise up with weapons against it. The problem with that is that how would it be organized? And the weaponry of the New World Order is superior to anything that the people have, and they would know about it before it even started, because it can monitor all of our cell phone calls and emails and so forth. So I believe that the best approach is to keep doing what you and I are doing, Russell, which is to tell people the truth. Because, people in government and military can also access the Internet. And when they realize that, some of them realize that they're working for the bad guys, you might see an implosion. I believe we are having an effect. You might see this implode from within. And who knows, there was once a movie called 7 Days in May about a military plot to take over the government. Not that I think that's a good idea, but if we did have some West Point types who were patriotic Americans, again, I realize I'm focusing on America here, but if they were to take over the government and attempt to restore a constitutional state, that would be preferable to the people rising up. But in spiritual terms, we certainly need to be, in physical terms, we need to be prepared. We need to be prepared for a grid down type of situation. But in terms of spiritual, we also need to be spiritually prepared. The Bible does tell us that the rule of the Antichrist will be limited to 3.5 years, and we need to prepare for our spiritual destiny and recognize that this is satanic. And on the opposite end of Satanism is God, the creator of the universe. Just as there is evil in the world, there's also good in the world, and we need to familiarize ourselves with the scriptures, much of which have been twisted and distorted by the whole Schofield, Hal Lindsey movement. I personally have been reading the books of David Lance Dean, who has a very clean and unbiased interpretation of the biblical prophecies, which makes sense to me, and I'm kind of glad to get away from that Hal Lindsey interpretation of events, which is really dictated by the New World Order itself to get us to do certain things. But absolutely, this is a spiritual battle, so while fighting evil, we need to be righteous ourselves, and to make sure that our relationship with God and Jesus Christ is the way it should be.
Personally, I think if each and every one of us focused on our communities first, that's probably the most beneficial route to go. You have far more influence on the people in your neighborhood, than you can possibly influence on a larger scale. So I always say be a good person in your neighborhood, and you'll see the rewards much faster.
That's right. Be good to your family, be good to your neighbors in your neighborhood. And you're absolutely right. I heard a talk by a guy who was able to stop Agenda 21 in his neighborhood by running for town government. We can't stop Hillary Clinton maybe from becoming president. You can't have much impact on the presidential election. But you're right, on a local level, you can. Just like a soldier in a battle, at his post, he can't win the whole war, but he can control the battleground in front of him. He can affect his immediate environment. And for most of us, that is what we do. In your case, Russell, you're actually reaching across the globe with your podcast. And so we try to affect people as broadly as we can for what's true and for what's right. But we also recognize our limitations, and we act within the limitations we have and don't set our hopes beyond what is realistic. But we also want to be as proactive as we can, as expanding our outreach as much as we can.
Your new book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, you can find this on Amazon or through your website, jamesperloff.com. Why is Truth a Lonely Warrior?
Because the mass media is controlling public opinion, and my experience has been in every time of history, there were lonely warriors. Just to take Pearl Harbor as an example, you had people like the Pacific Fleet Commander, who was attempting to, Husband Kimmel, who was attempting to tell the people that Washington knew about the attack in advance after he learned of that. And there were people in our Navy Department who never got promotions because of this, but they actually spoke up and tried to tell people, but they were drowned out. Their books were not reviewed by the New York Times. There was Robert Theobald, who was in Pearl Harbor. He wrote a book called The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, The Washington Contribution. These people were lonely warriors in their time, just as 9/11 truthers find themselves up against a brick wall of people saying our government would never do that to us. People back at the time of Pearl Harbor, and every major epoch of history, there have been a few people who have stood up for truth. I've found that out in my own research. So we don't want to be lonely. We want to have a lot of friends in this battle.
Research James Perloff. Go to www.jamesperloff.com. I really encourage my audience to buy one of these books or all of them, and to listen to this interview, share it with your friends, subscribe to my channel, like and comment. Can the audience pose questions to you directly, James? Can they send you emails?
Oh, absolutely. There's a contact form. They send me emails. And by the way, I'm also on Twitter.
There you go. James Perloff, thank you so much for being a guest on the program.
Hey, great show, Russell. It's very clear that you understand the issues. And thank you so much for your outreach and what you're doing as a warrior for truth.